Imagine this. You wake up one morning and look into the mirror. The face staring back at you is yours, but something feels off. There's a flicker of recognition, but also a strange unfamiliarity. You adjust your posture, tighten your expression, force a reassuring nod. There it is, the mask settling back into place. The mask you've worn for so long that even you have started to believe it's real. But deep inside, something shifts. A whisper of doubt. A fracture in the illusion. A moment of terrifying clarity. Who are you, really? And who have you been pretending to be? This is the silent war no one speaks about. The invisible battlefield between the self you cultivate for the world and the self that lingers in the shadows of your mind. Every day you engage in a performance, shaping your words, your gestures, your very thoughts to fit the expectations that surround you. You smile when you should. You say the right things. You suppress the thoughts that don't align with the version of yourself you've carefully constructed. But beneath the polished exterior, something else is at play. A deeper, unfiltered self, bound and silenced. And here lies the great paradox. The more you succeed in playing the role, the more you risk losing the truth beneath it. Think about it. From childhood, you were taught to adapt, to mold yourself into what society deems acceptable. Be polite. Don't make people uncomfortable. Fit in. Over time, this conditioning becomes second nature. You become fluent in the language of social survival, but at what cost? With every compromise, with every swallowed truth, a piece of your authentic self fades, until one day you wake up and realize you've become a stranger to yourself. But here's the real question. Is the person you pretend to be truly separate from who you are? Or have the boundaries between performance and reality blurred so much that even you can't tell where one ends and the other begins? Carl Jung called this conflict the war between the persona and the shadow. The persona is the face we present to the world, the curated, acceptable version of ourselves. The shadow is everything we repress, the desires, fears, and instincts that don't fit neatly into our constructed identity. For most people, the persona becomes a cage, keeping the shadow buried in darkness. But what happens when the shadow refuses to stay silent, when it begins to seep through the cracks of the illusion? Consider the moments when you act in ways that surprise even yourself, when anger, jealousy, or unexpected impulses erupt from within. That wasn't me, you tell yourself, but it was. It was the part of you you've ignored for too long, breaking through the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. The greatest danger is not the existence of this hidden self, it is the refusal to face it. Many people spend their entire lives running from their true nature, clinging desperately to the image they've built. They surround themselves with distractions, with validation, with the comforting illusion that the mask is all there is. But deep inside, an unease lingers, a quiet sense that something is missing, a feeling that no matter how perfectly they play their part, something remains unresolved. Now ask yourself, are you truly living as yourself? Or are you merely fulfilling a role, trapped in a silent war against your own authenticity? And more importantly, what would happen if you finally decided to face the truth? The battle between who you are and who you pretend to be is not just a matter of identity. It is the foundation upon which your entire life is built. The relationships you forge, the choices you make, the way you navigate the world. It all hinges on whether you are acting from a place of truth or deception. But before we can understand how to escape this cycle, we must first uncover the forces that created it. Why does this war exist in the first place? And what hidden forces keep it alive? The answer lies deeper than you think. Imagine living your entire life behind a mask so seamless, so well-crafted, that even you start to believe it is your real face. This is the silent war within you, the conflict between who you truly are and who you pretend to be. But why does this war exist? Why are so many trapped in this unseen struggle, perpetually oscillating between authenticity and artificiality? The answer lies deep within the architecture of the human psyche. Carl Jung called it the battle between the persona and the shadow. Your persona is the version of yourself sculpted to fit society's expectations, the mask you wear to navigate the world without rejection, judgment, or alienation. It is the polished, presentable self, the one that knows how to smile at the right moments, say the right things, and suppress the chaos within. The shadow, on the other hand, is everything you hide. Your suppressed desires, your raw emotions, your unfiltered thoughts. It is the self that lurks beneath, watching as your persona takes center stage. From childhood, we are taught, implicitly or explicitly, that certain aspects of ourselves are unacceptable. Perhaps you were told not to cry because strong people don't show weakness. Maybe you were conditioned to always be agreeable because conflict is bad. Slowly, the real you is dismembered piece by piece until all that remains is a hollow shell, a performance rather than a person. And like a method actor who never breaks character, you start to lose sight of where the act ends and the truth begins. But there's a price for this illusion. The more you suppress, the more the pressure builds. The more you perform, the more distant you become from your own essence. It is a slow estrangement from the self, an erosion of authenticity that leaves you disconnected, lost, and perhaps worst of all, numb. You find yourself exhausted by your own existence, as if every interaction, every social exchange, every moment in public is an elaborate pantomime that drains you of life. Jung wasn't alone in his observations. Friedrich Nietzsche warned against the dangers of self-betrayal in his concept of slave morality, the idea that society molds individuals into docile, obedient beings, stripping them of their natural instincts and replacing them with learned behaviors that serve the collective rather than the self. You learn to be good, not because it is your natural inclination, but because deviation invites exile. And so, you become a domesticated version of yourself, a self that conforms to expectations rather than one that thrives in truth. Arthur Schopenhauer took it further, proposing that human beings are fundamentally driven by the will to life, a blind, ceaseless striving to survive and avoid pain. But when survival means denying yourself, you become trapped in a paradox. You exist, but you are not alive. You speak, but your words feel hollow. You engage with the world, but it all seems like a scripted simulation, void of any real meaning or connection. Society, too, plays its role in reinforcing this fragmentation of self. From a young age, you are rewarded for compliance and punished for deviation. Schools do not nurture individuality, they mass-produce uniformity. Workplaces value predictability over creativity, obedience over originality. Social media amplifies this pressure tenfold, forcing you to curate an existence that is aesthetically pleasing, palatable, and, above all, acceptable to the faceless crowd. And so you become a collection of carefully chosen attributes, a fragmented self pieced together based on what the world wants from you. But this comes at a cost. The more you shape yourself for the external world, the more estranged you become from your internal world. You become fluent in the language of others, expectations, but forget the dialect of your own soul. The true horror of this condition is that most people never realize it. They spend their lives performing a script they did not write, unaware that the unease they feel, the exhaustion, the dissatisfaction, the quiet despair, is the silent protest of their buried self. This is the great psychological and existential tragedy, to live but never as oneself. But what happens when this war between the true self and the false self reaches its breaking point? When the mask begins to crack and the shadow demands to be seen? What happens when the carefully maintained illusion starts to fall apart? This is where the unseen consequences emerge, the fractures in identity that, if ignored, can lead to profound disillusionment and even self-destruction. Imagine carrying a mask for so long that one day you forget what your real face looks like. You search for a mirror, desperate for a glimpse of who you once were, but all you see is the reflection of a stranger. This is not the beginning of a horror story. It is the slow erosion of self, an insidious war that wears you down not with battles, but with silence. The war between who you are and who you pretend to be is not just an internal conflict. It spills over into every aspect of your life. Your relationships, your ambitions, even your perception of reality. The longer you maintain the illusion, the more exhausting it becomes. But exhaustion is not the worst consequence. The real danger is that you might never notice the war at all. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we present to the world, and the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress. When these two forces drift too far apart, the self begins to fragment. You no longer act, you perform. You no longer speak, you script. Every interaction becomes a calculation, every choice a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of coherence. But deep inside, something rebels. The suppressed self does not die. It festers. It manifests in unexplained anxiety, the gnawing sense that something is missing, or the sudden impulse to destroy everything you've built just to feel something real. This is why people who seem to have everything, a stable job, a loving family, social validation, can still feel profoundly empty. They are not living. They are maintaining a character. Society rewards conformity. From a young age, we are taught that survival depends on fitting in. We tailor our identities to be acceptable, likable, successful. But what happens when you have conformed so much that you no longer recognize yourself? What happens when your curated existence is so convincing that even you believe it? The answer is a slow, creeping numbness. A life where you do what is expected, not what is true. Where your achievements feel hollow because they were never truly yours. Where every conversation, every interaction, every expression of emotion is filtered through an unspoken question. Is this what they want me to be? Over time, the weight of this pretense crushes you. The need for validation becomes an addiction, yet no amount of external approval can fill the void of self-abandonment. You become a ghost in your own life, watching from the sidelines as your persona takes center stage. If the cost of pretending is so high, why don't we stop? Why don't we tear off the mask and step into our true selves? Fear. The fear of rejection. The fear of failure. The fear of discovering that we have spent years living a lie and have no idea how to start over. There is a reason why people stay in relationships that suffocate them, jobs that drain them, lives that do not belong to them. The unknown is terrifying, and so we cling to the known, even if the known is a prison. Jean-Paul Sartre called this condition bad faith, the self-deception required to live inauthentically. We convince ourselves that we have no choice, that this is simply the way things are. But deep down, we know the truth. The chains are self-imposed, but no one can live in perpetual conflict. Eventually, something snaps. For some, it is a quiet realization, a gradual awakening to the reality of their false self. For others, it is a violent rupture, a breakdown, a crisis, an act of self-sabotage so destructive that it forces them to confront what they have avoided for years. This is why midlife crises exist. This is why people suddenly abandon careers, relationships, entire identities. The facade becomes unbearable, and the need for authenticity outweighs the fear of its cost. But do we have to wait for collapse before we reclaim ourselves? Is there another way to end this silent war before it consumes us? There is, but it requires something radical: rebellion. Imagine standing at the edge of a mirror, staring at the two versions of yourself, the one you've built to survive and the one you've buried to stay accepted. The tension between them is unbearable. One whispers conformity, safety, and the approval of others. The other screams for liberation, for truth, for an existence unshackled by expectation. Most people never break free. They rationalize their imprisonment. They convince themselves that maintaining the illusion is the cost of survival. But what if the real cost is your very soul? The war between who you are and who you pretend to be will never end unless you rebel. Step 1. Dismantle the illusion. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process of integrating the fragmented parts of the self into a unified whole. But before you can unify, you must first confront the lies you tell yourself. Start with a brutal question. What part of your life feels artificial? Is it the way you speak, the way you dress, the way you force yourself to laugh at jokes that aren't funny? Is it the job you claim to love but secretly despise, the relationships you maintain out of duty, not connection? The first act of rebellion is recognizing the weight of the mask, acknowledging the areas of your life where you've been playing a role rather than living as yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche warned, "He who fights with monsters should be careful, lest he thereby become a monster." The monster, in this case, is the identity you've built for survival, and the danger is this: if you wear the mask for too long, you become the mask. But here's the truth they don't tell you. You can take it off at any moment. Step 2, kill the false self. This is where most people hesitate. They've spent years, decades even, constructing a persona that protects them. To remove it feels like death, because in a way it is. Psychologist Otto Rank called it the trauma of birth, the terrifying moment when an individual is forced out of their safe known existence into the raw, unfiltered world. The same happens when you shed your false self. You are reborn. But here's the paradox. The false self doesn't want to die. It will fight. It will whisper. What if they don't accept the real you? What if you end up alone? What if the world rejects you? This is where most turn back. They retreat to comfort, to approval, to the lie that sustains them. But if you dare to keep going, if you let the false self burn, you will experience something few ever do. Freedom. Step 3. Reclaim the unlived life. Jung called it the shadow self, the part of you that contains all the desires, dreams, and truths you suppress to fit in. Inside your shadow is the version of yourself that never saw the light of day. Who would you be if no one told you who to be? What would you pursue if judgment didn't exist? What thoughts would you allow yourself to think if there were no consequences? The real act of rebellion isn't anger or destruction, it's becoming whole. Every moment you reclaim a piece of yourself, the part that loves, that creates, that questions, that dares, you are breaking free. You are shifting from a life of quiet suffering to a life of deliberate existence. The mask is off. But now comes the hardest part, the final battle. Because once you have seen the truth, you can never unsee it. Now you must face the ultimate realization. What happens when you step fully into who you are? You stand at the threshold. The mask is gone, the illusions shattered, the false self buried. For the first time, you glimpse something terrifying, yourself, unfiltered, unrestrained, unmasked. But then the real question emerges. Now that you are free, what do you do with that freedom? Most people assume breaking free means instant peace, but the truth is far more unsettling. The weight of expectation is gone, but in its place remains an infinite abyss. The responsibility of defining your own existence. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, described this realization as existential nausea, the dizziness one feels when they realize there are no external rules dictating who they must be, no authority, no roadmap, no predefined purpose. At first, this feels exhilarating, but then a deeper anxiety creeps in. If no one is telling you who to be, then who are you? You spent years playing a role. Now, without a script, the silence is deafening. This is why so many people return to their chains. The mask, despite its suffocating weight, at least gave them direction. But you cannot go back. You have seen too much. Now you must ask yourself the question that every awakened mind must face. If I am no longer who I pretended to be, then who am I? Here is where many falter. They mistake freedom from illusion for freedom from responsibility. They assume that simply breaking free is enough. But Viktor Frankl, the renowned psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, warned against this trap. He argued that human beings need meaning as much as they need air. Without it, they fall into despair, nihilism, or worse, they invent new chains to replace the old ones. This is why so many who rebel against societal expectations fall into new prisons. Addictions, distractions, aimless rebellion. They mistake destruction for liberation. True freedom is not just the absence of control, it is the presence of purpose. The real challenge begins now. You must choose. If you are no longer bound by others' expectations, what will you pursue? If no one defines your worth, what will you create? If no external force dictates your identity, who will you become? The mind resists this responsibility. It longs for certainty, for someone else to define the path. But there is no one left to tell you what to do. And so, you must decide. The final revelation, the power of self-creation. Here is the truth that so few ever grasp. You are not a fixed entity. You are not a predefined story. You are not a label, a role, or a mere reflection of others' expectations. You are the author. The self is not something you find. It is something you build. Friedrich Nietzsche called this concept the Übermensch, the self-overcoming individual, who no longer passively follows inherited values but creates their own. It is not enough to strip away the false self. You must actively forge the real one, and this is where most hesitate, because it requires courage. It demands that you take full ownership of your existence, your failures, your victories, your pain, and your potential. There is no one left to blame, but there is also no one left to control you. In the end, there are only two paths. Return to illusion. Crawl back into the comfort of expectation. Resume the act. Pretend this awakening never happened. Step into the unknown. Build yourself from the ground up. Accept the terror of freedom, the burden of self-definition, and the infinite possibilities that come with it. Most will choose the first. It is easier, simpler. The burden of truth is too heavy for many. But you are already too far gone. You have seen the false self crack and shatter. You have felt the weight of your unlived life pressing against your soul. You have no choice but to move forward, and as you do, you realize something profound. The war between who you are and who you pretend to be was never external. It was never between you and the world. It was always you versus yourself. And now, for the first time, you are winning. The mask is gone. The war is over. The real journey begins.